The law of comparative advantage and specialization. Specialization and division of labor are the same concept. This is another concept addressed by Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. Early on in his book, Adam Smith wrote about a pin factory. Smith felt these workers in the pin factory were rather opinionated about their inefficient mode of production, and he believed he could help them out. From the pre-industrial farming age in England, people were used to surviving by mostly doing everything themselves to obtain what they needed. A family farm would likely be providing their own beef, chicken, eggs, and pork, growing a variety of different vegetables, making their own cheese, milk, bread, soap, candles, and even tools and weapons, longbows they call them, all for themselves. They made everything they owned themselves. And they always went to bed, which they made themselves, very exhausted at night, about 7 p.m. So when they began to industrialize to produce consumer goods, they maintained this antiquated business model. So when Adam Smith walked into this pin factory one day and found the pin workers all making their own pins, though he was polite, rumor has it he was heard to have mumbled something under his breath which sounded like pinheads. Each pin worker was individually producing around 10 to 20 pins per day. If the factory had 10 workers, total output would then only be about 100 to 200 pins per day. He stated that each worker should specialize in the production stage rather than just produce his or her own pins. Smith identified about 18 different skilled operations required to make pins: securing and delivering the metals and alloys, melting and stirring the molten alloys, pouring the melted alloys into vats which extruded the cooling metal into wire, straightening the wire, cutting the wire, making the head of the pins, sharpening the pin on a grinder, polishing the pin, making the package, labeling the package, putting the pins into the package. I think I'm still about 5 short, even with all of those different operations. When the workers specialized or divided up the labor and became experts at accomplishing their separate operation, and when they hired more workers to fulfill the role of each operation, pin-making efficiency for the factory increased to 86,400 total pins per day, about 4,800 per worker. Once the word of this productivity model got out, even local farmers began to divide up their chores and specialize in farm goods and decided to gather in trade markets to swap goods. Life then became a whole lot easier for the 18th and 19th century peasant farmer and his wife. I'm going to prove the specialization works. I'm going to name a state, and you tell me what that state specializes in. Idaho. Potatoes. Florida. Everybody. Oranges. Texas. Oil or cattle. Michigan. Automobiles. Nevada. Any illegal activity you can think of. Absolute advantage. The ability of an entity to produce merely a greater quantity of goods than another entity. Comparative advantage. The ability of an entity to produce a good at a lower marginal production cost than another entity. Essentially, absolute advantage means an entity, a country, a person can do it better. Comparative advantage means they can do it cheaper. Absolute and comparative advantage. Betty types 120 words per minute with 0 errors. Jim types 60 words per minute with 0 errors. Who should do the typing, Betty or Jim? Betty, you say. Why? Betty can type absolutely faster than Jim can. What type of advantage does Betty have over Jim? Absolute advantage. I forgot to tell you, though, Betty is a lawyer. A lawyer earns $60 an hour. A secretary earns $6 an hour. Betty is the lawyer, according to the information given. That makes Jim a secretary. A 600-word document has to be typed. How long does it take each person to type this document? How long does it take Betty to type this document? 5 minutes. 600 divided by 120 equals 5. How long does it take Jim to type this document? 10 minutes. 600 divided by 60 equals 10. How much would it cost each one to type this 600-word document? Betty, $5. Betty receives $60 an hour, or $1 per minute. It takes her 5 minutes to type the document. Jim, $1. Jim receives $6 an hour, or $1 for every 10 minutes. It takes Jim 10 minutes to type the document, so Jim would do it for $1. We know that it takes Betty 5 minutes to type the document. It takes Jim 10 minutes to type the document. We also know it costs Betty $5 to type the document, and it costs Jim $1 to type the document. According to this information, who should do the typing? Jim. Why should Jim do the typing? Because he has a comparative advantage. When one entity can produce something at a lower marginal opportunity production cost than another entity, when somebody can do it cheaper, in other words. A lot of words in economics are rather cryptic until you know the definition. It's just the way this study works. 5 minutes ago, you told me that Betty should do the typing. Now you're telling me that Jim should do the typing. Why? One more time, because Jim has the comparative advantage. Which is more important in economics, absolute or comparative advantage? Comparative advantage. So, take absolute advantage and kick it out the window. The more important of the two is comparative advantage. Next, let's check out the comparative advantage of international trade. Man-hours required. U.S. and Canada producing two different goods, maple syrup and copper wire. It takes the U.S. 5 man-hours to produce a barrel of maple syrup and 6 man-hours to produce a spool of copper wire. Canada, it takes 8 hours to produce a barrel of maple syrup and 7 hours to produce a spool of copper wire. Which country has the absolute advantage in the production of maple syrup? The U.S. In copper wire? The U.S. Because it can do so in less man-hours in each case. 3 less man-hours than Canada for maple syrup, 1 less man-hour for copper wire. That was easy. More importantly, which country has the comparative advantage with each good? Though it appears obvious in this scenario, because the U.S. is way more efficient at producing maple syrup than Canada, the explanation is a bit more technical. The U.S. absolutely has the absolute advantage over Canada in the ability to more efficiently produce both goods because it can produce both with less applied man-hours. So, what should you do with absolute advantage information? Kick it out the window. Nice. But this does not give us the comparative advantage answer. The question is, which country can produce each good at a comparatively lower marginal production opportunity cost than another country? Even though the results in this example may not reflect how things really are regarding trade between the U.S. and Canada, I would assume that Canada is a bit more efficient at producing maple syrup, just a guess. Let's explore why the U.S. has the comparative advantage with maple syrup and Canada has the comparative advantage with copper wire. When we're looking at one maple syrup and one copper wire and who should produce them, here is a way of looking at it. If the U.S. produces both maple syrup and copper wire itself, it's going to require 11 man-hours. If Canada produces both goods, it's going to require 15 of its man-hours. So let's have the U.S. produce 2 maple syrups instead. 2 times 5 equals 10. Let's have Canada produce 2 copper wires, and 2 times 7 hours would be 14 hours. Let's look at the results here. 10 man-hours compared to 11 man-hours. The U.S. saves 1 man-hour by not producing both goods itself. Canada saves 1 man-hour by not producing both goods itself, just by producing 2 copper wire. Should the U.S. keep the 2 barrels of maple syrup and Canada keep the 2 spools of copper wire? No, the U.S. should trade 1 barrel of maple syrup for 1 spool of copper wire. And both countries will still have 1 unit of each good as before, but will have each saved themselves 1 man-hour. Here is an even simpler way to see it. But what if Canada produced 2 barrels of maple syrup? 2 times 8 equals 16. And the U.S. produced 2 spools of copper wire instead. 2 times 6 equals 12. This cost the U.S. 1 more man-hour and also costs Canada 1 more man-hour. This is a comparative disadvantage for both countries. This would not be a good choice of output for the 2 countries, which trade would not solve, and also indicates why the U.S. has the comparative advantage with maple syrup, and Canada has the comparative advantage with copper wire. In this example, the U.S. has the comparative advantage at producing maple syrup. Canada has the comparative advantage at producing copper wire. Because each country can produce their single good at a comparatively lower marginal production opportunity cost through specialization and increased efficiency due to trade. The law of comparative advantage and specialization. This simple example then demonstrates the increased productivity, efficiency, and overall value of comparative advantage, specialization, and trade. The end.